And this is the reproductive system, the female reproductive system. So I'm going to show you a slide, a picture in a second. But essentially, the ovaries are where a woman is going to each month ovulate one egg. And so you have the female gametes, or the eggs made by the ovaries. The sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are going to be made in the ovary, and their target is going to be the endometrial lining of the uterus. If all goes well and after ovulation the egg is inseminated by a sperm, then the fertilized egg is then going to start to cleave and move down the fallopian tube until it reaches the uterus, and there it's going to be able to embed in the endometrial lining and start to form a placenta with the mother. The thing is that the estrogen and progesterone that are made by the ovaries prepare the uterus for accepting that egg. It builds up the lining of the endometrium, because prior to that, probably a week ago or so, a woman had her menses and that lining was shed. So the lining now has to be rebuilt. And that is going to be the job of estrogen, that helps make many, many, many layers. And then the progesterone, which is released later, is going to allow those layers to be very rich in food substances like glycogen. It's also going to make a lot of water, make it very lubricant, make it very inviting for the fertilized egg or embryo to be able to embed. And if everything goes well, 9 months later, you have a baby. So those are the two main organs: the ovary that makes the eggs, and the endometrial lining of the uterus where it embeds and develops into a fetus, and then eventually, with the contractions of the uterus, the fetus would be expelled. So those are the two major ones. You also have minor accessory organs that either connect or one with the other. So you do have uterine tubes like fallopian tubes, the smooth muscle of the uterus, which is not going to be used until the end, the vagina, which is able to receive and move the sperm up the female reproductive tract to fertilization. And so that is the internal, and then the external sex organs. I'll get there. So I'm trying to forward this little thing here. Here we go. So this is a diagram of the female reproductive tract. And I'm going to start with the ovary right here, because that's where one of them per month is going to ovulate one egg, and they will flip back and forth. But the source of the haploid egg or ova is going to be the ovary. That is going to be released into the fallopian tube, this very large pink structure. It has a lot of smooth muscle, so with peristalsis, it's able to move that egg, whether it's fertilized or not, down the fallopian tube and then to the uterus. So, and this is just showing a cross-section of the ovary and a cross-section of the fallopian tube. Here is the uterus, and as you can see, the majority of the cells of the uterus are muscle, smooth muscle. So, but the part that the embryo is going to embed in is the innermost lining, which is the endometrial lining right about here. What the sperm has to do is it has to enter in the vagina and then swim up past the cervix and the and the uterus and the fallopian tube. And if the gods are good, there is an egg that has been released, and you get fertilization, and then the fertilized egg starts to grow and develop, and peristalsis is going to move it into the endometrial lining for it to embed and eventually form a placenta. Okay, so this is a cross-section of an ovary. And the thing about this that's kind of unique is that the 2B egg, which is right here in the center, is surrounded by these nurse-like cells. These are cells called follicle cells. And what the follicle cells do is that they are able to not only protect the egg and help the egg develop, but they also make estrogen and progesterone and start to prepare the endometrial lining of the uterus. So one lucky egg, and there's about 1 million or so, but one lucky egg in one lucky ovary in one lucky month is going to start to develop. And so after, if you think about the menstrual cycle being 28 days, and that maybe the first 5 days is menses, you're going to have the pituitary gland be able to regulate the timing of all of this. So when menses begins, that's day 1. So it will slowly start to make follicle stimulating hormone. And the whole idea is that it's going to start to stimulate these follicle cells. And as that happens, you are going to have the follicle cells start to make estrogen. And the peak of estrogen is usually in the first 2 weeks, like day 1 to 14, as it steadily progresses. And that then is going to allow the endometrial lining that has just been shed to continue to form layer upon layer upon layer and replace that. The other thing is that the egg or ovum, it started its development, and I'll talk about this later, as a fetus. And now it's going to complete meiosis 1 so that you will have these, meiosis 1, and you'll start to see the development and the maturation of the egg. Now, what will happen on day 14 is ovulation. And when the egg is ovulated, it actually ruptures through the ovary into the fallopian tube, which sweeps it up and then progresses to move it by peristalsis down the fallopian tubes. What is left behind are the follicle cells, these yellow cells. And they were pink to begin with, but now they're yellow. And that has a lot to do with the fact that once you've got ovulation and the egg is in the fallopian tube, the remaining follicle cells start to make a second hormone, and that is what gives it the yellow color, and that's progesterone. So because now the progesterone and the estrogen is being made, and you've got this color, this yellow, scientists labeled that the corpus luteum, because luteum means yellow in Latin. So now we're into the second half. So the first half, you ovulate then on day 14, then day 14 to day 28. And during that period of time, you've got your progesterone and estrogen, both are working on the endometrial lining. It should be very thick at this stage of the game, and the progesterone is going to be able to have it absorb a lot of water and nutrients so that when the embryo arrives, it is able to easily embed and get food before it's able to fuse with the mother's blood supply. So if indeed that happens, that's great, where the corpus luteum will survive. If not, and there is no fertilization, then you're going to have that degrade into a corpus albicans, and as it dies, then the estrogen and progesterone levels plummet, and the endometrial lining can no longer be maintained, and the woman will then start her menses. So that's kind of the overview there. It gets summarized a little bit later on. Okay, there we go. This is the uterine wall, and the reason why I wanted to show this is when the embryo comes down, and the embryo would be at the top, it then has to embed in that endometrial lining and eventually come in contact and merge with these maternal capillary arteries and venules. And then that would be the way that the fetus with the placenta is able to have the mother breathe for the fetus and eat for the fetus and take away the waste products from the fetus. Okay. So we have the vagina, which is going to be the first part, and that is going to be the passageway both for sperm and for the birth of the baby, as well as menstruation. Okay, oogenesis. So, oogenesis is unique in that, unlike other mammals, let's say cats or dogs that have litters of 5 to 8, pups or kitties, we only are designed for one baby at a time. So part of that is going to be the ovaries taking turns in ovulating one egg, but you also have to account for the fact that you have the process of meiosis, and you have, at the end of meiosis, 4 cells, but you only want to present 1 cell or 1 ova that can be fertilized. So this is kind of what I'm going to be going over with the process of oogenesis, because we've already gone through the process of meiosis and the process of spermatogenesis, which is very straightforward. This is not straightforward. And that has to do with the fact that in evolution, with Homo sapiens only having 1 baby at a time, then you have to find a way of obeying the law of meiosis, but only producing 1 viable egg per month. So here goes. The way that it happens is that in the fetal period, and that's for every female, you are going to start meiosis 1. So you're going to have an oogonium, and it is going to undergo the S phase of the cell cycle, just like the sperm, double the chromosome to 92, and now it's a primary oocyte. So when you have that, you start meiosis 1, but the only phase that you do completely is prophase 1, that crossing over. And that's important because when you are doing crossing over, which is a very fragile process, you're doing it internally. It is hopefully very stress-free, and you have the mother providing the oxygen and nutrients, getting rid of the waste products. And apparently this is the best time to do it, a time where you're not going to be in a period, let's say, of a lot of stress or other types of environmental stressors, where the crossing over might break and end up giving you fragments that are either too much or too little in the eggs, and then that would end up being a miscarriage. So the actual critical process of crossing over takes place as a fetus in the protection of the mother's womb. Then once that happens, there's something called metaphase arrest. In other words, it just stops. It does crossing over, prophase 1, it gets along the equatorial plate, and then that's it. And once that's done, then the baby is born, and everything, is the same until puberty. Now, at puberty, this is how we're going to get around that whole issue of you only want to ovulate 1 egg per month. So at puberty, one of the activated oocytes is going to finish meiosis 1. So you're going to have 2 diploid cells, but you only have 1 baby. So what do? So the first is called a polar body, and the second is the actual viable secondary oocyte. Let me explain about a polar body. You got to make 2 cells, but 1 cell is going to be the chosen one, and the other one is going to be a dud. And so what actually happens is that the polar body is so tiny that it has a nucleus and just a little bit of cytoplasm and a plasma membrane. That's it. It's probably no bigger than a sperm. where your secondary oocyte is quite large, has lots of cytoplasm, mitochondria, vacuoles filled with food, and so forth and so on. So the way that you get around it is you make one very large viable egg, and then the other cell is a non-viable polar body. Quite literally, if you could take a polar body and have it be inseminated by a sperm, by the time the fertilized egg divided a couple of times, it would die because it would just had run out of nutrients, run out of fuel. So that's how you kind of get around it. You do two cells, one's a dud and one's viable. Okay, now what's going to happen next is you ovulate that egg. And if it's penetrated by the sperm, it takes a while for that sperm to get to the center of the cell. And during that period of time, that cell will undergo meiosis too. So in the end, you've got 3 defunct polar bodies and 1 viable egg that is going to be fertilized by that sperm. And then that means that the sperm is haploid, the egg is haploid, everybody's happy. Now the only thing is that you are not ever going to complete meiosis 2 if there's no sperm there. The body kind of feels like, why bother? Why bother go through finishing meiosis when there's no fertilization? So if there is no sperm there, it just does not continue. And it's about the size of a head of a pin, and it gets kind of absorbed or moves out with the menstrual cycle that's going to be coming up because there's no fertilization. So it's an interesting process. It ends up adapting to the laws of biology, but still maintaining the one pregnancy, because we're really not built for more than one as far as being upright on 2 feet and our pelvic structure. So one way that we get around it is by following the rules of meiosis, but we have 3 defunct polar bodies, only 1 viable haploid egg, and we only actually make that viable haploid egg if there is fertilization by the sperm. So it's different in females than in males. So this is just showing you, it's correlating meiosis with what's happening as far as the follicle cells and the egg in the ovary. And it was a summary of what I just went over. So what specifically is happening, and I'm going to take the ovarian cycle in like 2 big chunks. The first 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, because it's going to be this mythical 28-day cycle. Day 14, you ovulate, and away we go. So it's controlled by the pituitary gland. So you're on this 28-day cycle, and the pituitary gland has a built-in clock. So it knows when menses has occurred. That's day 1. It starts to release the follicle stimulating hormone that goes to the ovary. And now the follicle cells surrounding this immature egg is going to start to release estrogen, and then the estrogen is going to start to build up the endometrial layers once again. Then what will happen is day 14 you ovulate, and then we go into the luteal phase, because when you have that egg be released by the ovary into the fallopian tubes, remember that the follicle cells are now going to start to turn that yellow color because it's going to produce progesterone, which has this yellow color to it, and we call it the corpus luteum. And so it's called the luteal phase because it's after ovulation that you start the progesterone, which is kind of finishes off that endometrial lining. And then, if the gods are good, you will have the continuation of that corpus luteum and then the continuation of estrogen and progesterone if you're pregnant. But if you're not pregnant, there's no reason. So those, the corpus luteum will age, the estrogen and progesterone levels go down, and eventually the woman will have another menses 28 days later. Okay, so here we go with the ovary. This is just another diagram that I must have loved. So here you have the immature egg, and the follicle stimulating is going to then allow that maturation, and then the estrogen, And then once you've got ovulation, which is right here, the rupturing through, then you have luteinizing hormone that is going to help in that ovulation and help in the formation of the corpus, luteum. And that then means estrogen and progesterone, and if everything it gets fertilized, then we'll be able to implant that embryo into the endometrial lining. If not, there's no fertilization, that corpus luteum is going to age into the corpus albicans. Albicans means white in Latin. And as it shrivels up and dies, essentially, then the estrogen and progesterone levels go plummeting down. There's nothing to sustain that endometrial lining, and it's shed on day 28, or starting to be shed on day 28. So that's just another diagram. Okay, here we go. Ovulation. So we've got the follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary at the beginning on day 1, and then on day 14 to the end is going to be luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, and that is going to bring that to fruition, either pregnant or non-pregnant. Okay, so this just goes into what I've been talking about, but it's nice to have it on one slide. We've got to the point of ovulation, day 14. We have the egg rupture through into the fallopian tubes. The follicle cells are called the corpus luteum, a yellow body. They start to secrete progesterone as well as estrogen. Now, here comes the part that is a little bit tricky. Let's do the non-occur, because I did this first. If no pregnancy, no sperm, fertilizes that egg, then the corpus luteum degenerates and dies 10 days or so later. And again, it's very slow and then gets quite rapid in its death throes towards the end of the 28 days. So it becomes this dying white body, corpus albicans. Obviously it's dying, so it's not making a lot of estrogen and progesterone, and then that is what is keeping the endometrial lining there. Without it, this woman's going to have a menstrual period on day 28. It'll start to bleed. If pregnancy does occur and you got a sperm meeting that egg, that secondary, right, meiotic egg is going to then end up having this embryo. Now, it's really an embryo, but I say fetus because I just don't want so many names. So the embryo or fetus saves itself. I love this. It makes a hormone, and it's the embryo and the fetus that makes the hormone, not the woman. And the fetus then, or the embryo, produces human chorionic gonadotropin. You can see why it's abbreviated to HCG. And so when that embryo, which will eventually become a fetus, is going down that fallopian tube, it starts making this hormone that will keep the corpus luteum alive. Because the corpus luteum is making estrogen and progesterone that's keeping the endometrial lining alive. So, lucky fertilized egg that is now an embryo to be a fetus, as it rounds the corner from the end of the fallopian tube into the endometrial lining of the uterus, it is greeted with a very thick, very rich, very juicy endometrial lining, very easy to implant into, very easy to make a placenta, and then that is going to establish the communication between the mother and the fetus. So that's what happens if there is a sperm there greeting it. And that's it. So that brings us to the end of reproduction. So I will see you soon. Thank you.